If you hang out in trans-centered parts of the internet long enough, you'll probably see multiple people say some version of.
When I was 3 years old, I told my mother, "Mommy, I'm not a boy. I'm a girl." I knew I was trans without ever having heard the word.
I think the "I knew at age 3" narrative is important because it drives home that transness is innate, not something we hear about and decide to try out for fun. But it sometimes feels like, "I knew at age 3" is the only trans origin story we ever hear, when in fact, plenty of us didn't figure ourselves out until later in life. Trans people's self-discovery stories are all different, and they're all valid. Grab a comfy chair because I'm about to tell you mine. Disclaimer: if I listed every trans foreshadowing moment in my life, this video would be 5 hours long. This is merely a highlight reel of sorts. My parents called me a girl, and they seemed to know more about how the world worked than I did, so I trusted their judgment. I did not come to them at 3 years old to explain that I wasn't a girl. However, when I was a bit older, I think maybe 6 or 7, I became keenly interested in doing the things that boys do. I bought the idea that I was a girl, but I didn't necessarily like it, so I was eyeballing what I thought was the only other option. For 1 or 2 summers I insisted on going shirtless on hot days because boys did. And I remember trying to pee standing up once by straddling the toilet. That did not work out. I don't want to talk about it. I saw that boys around me seemed preoccupied with proving how strong and tough they were all the time. I tried to do all of that too.
I need some big strong volunteers to move some tables.
Me.
When I was 12, a friend made an offhanded joke about someone getting a sex change and I immediately got very intense about wanting to know if that was a real thing a person could do. This would have been 1985 or so, and the word transgender was not on my radar whatsoever. I don't think it was on anyone's. My friend assured me that a sex change was a real thing, though she was unclear on the exact process. I imagined some huge, hilarious Rube Goldberg machine where girls went in and boys came out, or vice versa. For weeks after that conversation, maybe even months, I asked myself whether I would walk into that machine if given the opportunity. Ultimately I decided, rather reluctantly, that I would not. Being a boy looked like it demanded even more macho posturing than I was already doing. It looked exhausting. I didn't think I'd like having to play that role 24/7. I was a late bloomer, and at age 13 or 14 I largely felt pretty good about not having hit puberty yet. I remember thinking that I didn't want pointless globs of fat on my chest that people would sexualize. And periods sounded horrible, but I assume nobody enjoys those. And yet, I also sometimes wished I looked or felt more feminine. I was supposedly a girl, after all, and people regularly told me in one way or another that I was doing it wrong. It was hard not to feel like a freak and a failure. I guess you could say I was caught in a tug-of-war between internal feelings and external pressures. These pressures yanked me back and forth between wanting to be less of a girl and wanting to be more of one. It was a confusing time. Puberty finally hit me at age 16, by the way. It was exciting to feel like I was finally becoming an adult, but at the same time, the changes were often frustrating and made my body feel sort of alien to me. I don't know that I can attribute that to being trans though. I feel like pretty much everyone has an angry alien phase during puberty. At age 21, I left my hometown to seek a fresh start in a new city. By this point, I'd grown out of my gawky teenaged phase and was dressing a little better than I had been previously. Suddenly, I was around a lot of guys who had never known me as the class loser. They just thought I was hot and wanted to get me in bed. This was fantastic as far as I was concerned. I was a huge horn dog with self-esteem issues and undiagnosed ADHD. Hooking up with a shiny new person usually gave me temporary respite from all 3 of those things. I went out clubbing every weekend in hopes of bringing someone home at the end of the night. One notable thing that happened around this time is that I had an ongoing quest to find the perfect black jeans and black t-shirt to wear to the goth club, but nothing I tried on ever looked right and I couldn't articulate why. It wasn't until decades later that it occurred to me, my favorite nightclub had a ton of slender, broad-shouldered, narrow-hipped dudes dressed all in black, and when I tried on those jeans and t-shirts, that was what I hoped to look like. This was impossible though, because I had an entirely different body shape than they did. Anyway, I was in denial or I don't know what, because back then I never consciously noticed that I was picturing men as my style inspiration, much less questioned why. I just tried on clothes and felt like my reflection in the mirror was frustratingly wrong. During this very same time period, I also sometimes longed to have a bigger chest than I did. I had wide hips and a narrow waist, and I felt that men would really appreciate it if those proportions were balanced out by a gigantic set of jugs. Once again my mind was being pulled in opposing directions by internal versus external forces. I'd never entirely stopped thinking about the idea of a sex change. But my current meat suit was suddenly an excellent tool for getting me laid, and I didn't want to possibly mess that up. After a couple of years of chasing dopamine in nightclubs, I impulsively married a man I'd met on a phone chat line. The marriage, like my one attempt at peeing standing up, was messy in completely predictable ways, and I'm going to gloss past it. I ended my marriage and moved into my own place at 32, and a bunch of feelings I'd been smashing down for the sake of keeping the peace started bubbling up. Not just gender stuff. Polyamory and kink stuff too. Maybe I'll tell you those stories one day. Anyway, my internal gender conflict briefly bobbed all the way to the surface, and I experimented with trying to pass as a man during short forays out of my apartment. From what I could tell, I was indeed able to be perceived as a man, and this gave me some amazing and confusing feelings that I didn't know how to deal with. I stopped the experiments. Meanwhile, by my 30s the internet had become an established thing, so I was able to easily look up niche subjects that would have been more difficult to learn about before. One subject I repeatedly sought out was trans people and their transition journeys, though of course I told myself I was just randomly curious and didn't personally relate to the topic at all. One thing I either hadn't known or hadn't truly thought about before was that it's not uncommon for a trans person to be ostracized from their family or to lose their partner, housing, job, or all of the above when they come out, but obviously, lots of trans people come out anyway. Which made me realize that being openly trans isn't something anyone would do on a whim. Trans people must feel their real genders incredibly strongly if they're willing to risk everything over it. But that thought brought me up short because, was gender supposed to have a feeling? I didn't think I experienced that. Why didn't I experience that? Then the internet taught me concepts like non-binary and genderqueer and genderfluid, and my lack of gender feels began to make sense. I started using those labels for myself sometimes, but I was inconsistent about it. By the end of my 30s, I knew there was no sex change machine that could instantly swap out your entire body. Medical transition, as we call it now, is more like a menu of various things that people can pick and choose from, depending on their needs and goals. For me, the first menu option would be going on testosterone. And I kind of wanted to try. But change is scary. The meat suit I was assigned may not have been ideal, but I was accustomed to it. Also, I didn't want to have to explain transitioning to my coworkers, or to jeopardize things with the various straight men I was dating. I told myself that I was fine as I was, and life went on. In my 40s, I continued squishing most of my trans feelings down so they couldn't disrupt my job or relationships. I started getting really into dresses and makeup, in part because I thought if I spent time elaborately decorating my meat suit, I might enjoy living in it more. Then 2020 happened. When the lockdowns hit, I was living with my housemate Bern, who had a job he could do from home. He stepped up to pay 100% of the household expenses so I could stop working, stay home, and be safe. I didn't happen to be sleeping with anyone at that moment, and now I wasn't working either. I was sitting at home, just floating in a little bubble of solitude, out of the public eye. In trans circles, we call someone who hasn't yet figured out that they're trans an egg. When they eventually have a definitive, "oh shit I'm trans" realization, we call this their egg cracking moment. All the thinking I did while confined indoors led to 5 big epiphanies that combined to crack my egg wide open. First off, as someone under the non-binary umbrella I'd been thinking of myself as neither cis nor trans but some nebulous third thing. But one day I remembered that being transgender isn't about being the opposite gender from what everyone assumed, and it's not about transitioning. The official definition is simply, someone who has a different gender from the one they were assigned. That's it. And when I was born, the doctor didn't tell my mother,
"Congratulations. It's a girl, kind of, sometimes."
Therefore, I was entitled to call myself trans if I wanted. And then I realized I'd been mistaken when I conceived of myself as sometimes a girl in the first place. The word gender fluid had resonated with me in the past, because it refers to someone whose gender fluctuates, and I'd sometimes enjoyed dressing in feminine things and sometimes enjoyed dressing in masculine things. But I suddenly remembered that clothing isn't gender. There was more to my thought process here than just clothes, but for brevity's sake let's just say something clicked and I knew that I was never a girl or woman, not even sometimes. Nor was I a man. My next epiphany was about sex versus gender. The internet had already taught me that gender and sex are two separate things. Of course they are, otherwise trans people wouldn't exist. But only during my lockdown ruminations did my brain finally take this thought to its obvious conclusion, which is that if sex and gender are separate, my wanting to have testosterone and muscles and etc. didn't inherently mean I was a man. I could be non-binary and still want those things. Then I stumbled over an online article that made me realize I'd been somewhat misunderstanding what dysphoria is, and the many forms it can take. Plus I realized just how much stuff I'd been suppressing. It became clear that I had more dysphoria than I'd been assuming. And it started weighing on me. And finally, I'd been assuming that a doctor would only give me testosterone if I said I was a full-on trans man. But then I happened to see some stuff online about non-binary people being prescribed testosterone. And some of them even opted for a low dose, or went on testosterone for a little while and then decided to stop. There was a lot more flexibility to things than I'd thought. And that is how I came out as trans, and began the process of transitioning, at the ripe old age of 47. If you have an egg-cracking story of your own to share, please leave it in the comments. I'd love to build a repository of sorts where people can see how varied trans people's journeys actually are. And if you enjoyed this video, I hope you'll hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.